Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton and Greg White with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's live stream. Today's show, we're going to be speaking with a couple of supply chain thought leaders that's going to be sharing some really proven best practices for how we can find, as organizations, find efficiencies during these really challenging times. Proven strategies and tactics for helping to move the ball forward with this landscape that we're all fighting through here. So stay tuned for what will be promises to be a very practical conversation that's going to increase your supply chain IQ. So a quick programming note before we get started here. If you enjoy our live stream episodes, be sure to check out our podcast, and you can find it and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. I want to welcome in my esteemed fearless co-host, Mr. Greg Wright, serial supply chain tech entrepreneur and trusted advisor. Greg, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I kind of like the way we're staging this in. That's fun, right?
Hey, learning and applying. I think that's the cycle we're all in right now.
You know what's interesting is I was just thinking that Q1 of 2020 is already behind us. I mean, it's crazy to think of it that we have come that far in the year so far. And it also made me think that when we started these live streams, the very first one we did was the U.S. Bank quarterly freight payment index, right? And it's about time for that to come around again. I think April 23rd, we have a live stream where we're going to do that and use all of these platforms to get that out.
Right.
It'll be, considering what's happened with the pandemic, it'll be really interesting to think about what those numbers will reflect and what, if anything, they can help us, project into the future. But in any case, it's a great service that U.S. Bank does. They process almost $27 billion a year of freight payments. So they have really good eyes on how freight is trending. And they were able to tell us some interesting stuff from the end of last year, which was a rough enough year for freight to begin with, but it's good. Anyway, it's good. It'll be good to see what's going on. Whether it's good news or not, at least we'll get some eyes on it and hopefully get some insights into the future.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a bunch of folks already jumping in. Calandra and Patrick and Carla, welcome. All those folks are on LinkedIn. And Mark Preston. Hey, Mark, how you doing? So let's, with no further ado, we've got a great show lined up with two folks that been there and done that. Are going to offer some really great insights. So I want to welcome in our featured guest here today, Paul Noble, founder and CEO at Verusen, and Phil Ideson, founder and managing director at Art of Procurement. Paul and Phil, good afternoon.
Hey, gentlemen, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. Yeah, great having you.
Great to have you. Really have enjoyed, of course, Paul, we've collaborated on a number of these. First time on the live stream, so welcome. And Phil, we've been fans of yours and Art of Procurement. Of course, one of your regular collaborators, Kelly Barner, for a number of years. And it's so great to finally, collaborate with you and share your insights with our audience.
Thank you very much. No, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited to do this, and thanks for inviting me.
You bet. All right, so let's give our audience the opportunity to get to know both of y'all here. So, Phil, let's start with you. Tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah, so, how to answer that as quickly as possible. I've been about 20 years in the procurement space, whether it's the direct materials within the automotive industry and manufacturing, or more latterly on the indirect product services side as well. Really being involved in every different aspect of procurement. Procurement goes from a sourcing perspective to, we need to buy a product or a service through supplier management, through the procure to pay process, supplier collaboration, lots of different elements of procurement. So I've really tried to touch all of it. I was fortunate in my career to be able to become a head of international procurement for a financial services company. I was involved with them it was automotive lending, with a mortgage company on the side, focusing on subprime at the height of the last recession. So, we had to take bailout money and going through that journey of taking bailout money, which, a lot of companies are going to be facing right now. After those kind of experiences, I moved on to the consulting side and was delivering a lot of kind of procurement outsourcing and helping folks from a procurement transformation perspective. About 5 years ago, I set up Art Procurement. So Art Procurement really looks at, helping organizations maximize the value of the money that they spend with their suppliers, transforming the capabilities of procurement teams. And we do content as well for the podcast. But for us, it's really all about, and this is kind of where a lot of my background comes from, how do we think differently about what procurement can do? How do we think about procurement as somebody who's really enabling what the business needs are, as opposed to perhaps something that we may have done in the past, which was show up with a process, a policy, say, this is what you're going to do, and, kind of operate that silo where there wasn't that much of a connection between our performance and what the business was actually doing, or what the business actually needed.
Love that. So we're getting a little bit of feedback. So real quick, before we have Paul weigh in, we're getting some audio feedback, I believe. So we're going to try to self-mute as often as we can. Thank you, Claudia and Jonathan Townsley. I want to share a couple things here. Pratik, good afternoon. You tuned in with us yesterday on the live stream. You've got a great inventory question we're going to get to here momentarily. And we also want to say hello to Halit from Turkey. So thanks for joining us from the logistics industry there in the country of Turkey. All right, so let's flip over, and Paul Noble, I'd love for you to weigh in and share. Our regular listeners have heard a little bit about your background, including your basketball all-star prowess. But share a little bit more about yourself.
All right. No, good to be back. And so Paul Noble, founder and CEO of Verusen. We are a supply chain intelligence company focused on materials management, really focused heavily in the global manufacturing sector. And that's where I grew up. So spent 10 plus years working for the Sherwin-Williams company in industrial distribution, which exposed me and kind of grew, fell in love with supply chain, if that sounds appropriate. I think as we all have. And the importance and the backbone it is to our economy and societies, as we're seeing now in today's environment. So enjoy always joining you all, and it's great to meet you, Phil, and be able to talk a little bit of strategy. I think the uncertainty right now is the biggest challenge. Greg, you and I were talking about that the other night, and as we creep into gathering a little more certainty, it's going to be important to be reacting and taking action in a multitude of different places. So
great point. Absolutely. Want to quick shout out to Thitso, who's watching us from Botswana. Hello, Thitso. Okay, so let's shift gears. Now that we've got a little bit of background on both Phil and Paul, I want to shift gears to the current environment. Right? We all know it's challenging for everybody, especially for global supply chain professionals and leaders and the operation. Before we start talking, before we pick your brain and have you both share some proven best practices and some ideas of how you can position the operation and your supply chain to move ahead in these times, I want to pick your brain and get a couple of observations, just recent observations that are really intriguing to you in the last few days of what's taking place across industry. And Phil, I want to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's an overused cliche about talking about uncertain times right now, because things are so uncertain for a lot of organizations. But we kind of look at things, organizations are either in growth mode and sometimes unexpected growth mode because of all the changes that we're seeing. They may be in kind of figuring out what's happening. I'm going to wait for a little while before I make any decisions. So it's kind of status quo, or those that are really having that moment of, things have really changed and things have changed materially for me. And how some of those companies are kind of adapting that I'm seeing depend on which one of those three buckets they're in. But one of the things that I think is clear for everybody is that we're really looking at how do we ensure that we maintain supply. That's still number one. What is thought process, I think, is that kind of disaster recovery, if you will. I'm seeing that across different companies, no matter what the industry is. And then you start thinking about, okay, now that we have some control over our supply chain, what do we need to do proactively to identify where the red flags may be coming down the road as more and more suppliers get in trouble? And then secondly, which is more interesting, but it's more looking towards the medium and the longer term, is how can I start to build stronger relationships with my suppliers when I start getting out of the back end of this? Because I think a lot of companies realize that maybe they weren't as supplier friendly as they could have been, and they hadn't really looked at things from a, which are my most important suppliers, and how can I make sure that my relationships with those are as strong as possible? So I see people starting to think about that, not really doing anything yet, because order of the day is just making sure that supply is kind of, whether that's physical product or virtual product, frankly, virtual services, that's what I see is really front of mind still at the moment.
Great point. So it's really the art of relationships and the value of relationships in procurement in many ways. We've got a couple of questions, which Pratik, I promise we're going to get to your question today. So stay tuned for just a second. Paul, I want to shift gears, and as we open this conversation, what's a development or two that's really gotten your attention?
Yeah, I think we're coming into shelter in place and everyone working from home and seeing how this was going to escalate and scale. We started talking about the ripple effects that we're going to see. I think we're starting to see a few of those across certain industries, having conversations with supply chain leaders on plants shifting what they do to support the efforts, I think is really interesting. And it disrupts other things. The inavailability of PPE as it's needed, inavailability to manufacturing companies as it's now shifted the supply to the people on the front lines as it should, really affects certain industries where personal protective equipment is essential to making sure the product is safe, that they're producing, as well as the people producing it. So I think that there's some interesting ripple effects there as things that are happening and shifting in one part of the supply chain based on inavailability is affecting production in other places that may not have, we may not have seen as an ultimate issue from the get-go here.
Yeah, curveballs, they keep coming. Two quick points before I toss it over to Greg here. So Mark weighs in, Mark Preston on LinkedIn. His observation is it's a wake-up call for reshoring, but even more for supplier development and developing technical trades in the U.S. Great point there, Mark. And also, before I pass the baton over to Greg, Phil and Paul and Greg, as we walk through this conversation, this is the question that Pratik was really asking us yesterday, and we asked him to wait until today when we're talking with folks that are experts on inventory management. So if you just jot that question down, and as we dive into the conversation, let's make sure we touch on some answers there. Okay. So with that said, Greg, what's your observations? And then we're going to dive right into some of the best practices here.
It seems things are really fast moving right now, and the dynamics that we're seeing, they change virtually every single day. One of the discussions I've had today already multiple times is that rather than traditional sourcing methods, people are sourcing from new channels. And in fact, that includes consumers. I just had a discussion. I talked with a USA Today reporter earlier today, and one of the discussions we had, and this appears to be common around the country, possibly around the world, is that certain goods are hard to find at grocery. So people are sourcing those through what would otherwise be unavailable sources, restaurants, which are providing bags of rice and beans and whatever else they might have available, or distribution. The distributors that distribute to restaurants and to grocery have those goods available, and they're, and the goods are being sourced in a non-traditional fashion. Reshoring is certainly something that people are talking about. The need to at least have secondary sourcing opportunities in your own country, whatever that is, not be so reliant on a foreign source. That's certainly a big point of concern and something that we see people working towards. And I'm finally seeing, I mean, I say finally, it's only been a few weeks, but finally starting to see companies put tiger teams in place that are focused on this problem and helping the people whose job it is to handle the everyday issues to give the appropriate amount of focus and the right responses to the issues created by this particular problem. And that's really important because they are moving so fast, and a word that we use all the time right now, they are unprecedented. So it's very difficult for the traditional teams or the normally positioned teams to tackle those.
Excellent.
So
go ahead, Greg.
A little bit about those current observations. What I'd like to do is toss it out to the group and talk about, some proven best practices for this kind of environment, not this specific environment, but certainly we've all faced supply chain disruptions before. And if what kind of applicability there could be to this particular environment of those approaches. Phil, you want to take that first?
Yeah, and actually I just wanted to build on a couple of things. I just took a couple of notes from what you just said there as well. When you're talking about sourcing things in different ways, you gave the grocery example. Ironically, just within our family, we have folks who can access things in Puerto Rico, sending them to California. Us being able to access something in the States that my family can't access in the UK and vice versa. And already talking about like, how do we help each other get hold of things that aren't available in our location, which obviously you'd never think about in normal times. But, you apply that to procurement. One of the things that procurement is kind of challenged with is that, we often have processes. So how do you really realize when the time is that process doesn't apply? Process doesn't apply to getting PPE material because we just need it. You need it now. You don't need to go through a formal sourcing process. You shouldn't really even go through a formal approval process, except for perhaps one decision maker. And that can sometimes be difficult if you're in that mentality where you've really got to drive a process versus how can I be as agile as possible so my organization can get exactly what it needs as soon as it can get it. And that turns some of the procurement process on its head. So that's something that I'm definitely seeing like as an observation right now in how people are reacting is, taking down some of that formality for those products and services that businesses need and they need now, because that's more important, frankly, than making sure that you check all the boxes.
Great point. Several great points there.
Well, I think at the same time, because so many people are going to new sources, we just had this discussion earlier today that you have to still have, I think, a very strong verification process, because if you're going to new sources, there are opportunists out there that you want to avoid falling into that trap, right?
Trust is still really important, and kind of building into your networks as much as anything to avoid those kind of situations.
Yeah.
Quick comment here on trust from Matthew on LinkedIn. He says, I see a great application for blockchain where multiple suppliers and buyers can exchange data and assets without trusting each other. That's an interesting observation there, Matthew. So, Phil, I think you touched on this a little bit, approaching things programmatically, which I had to practice saying 18 times this morning. Speak to that for a second.
Yeah, so this is really when you're thinking specifically around, okay, as an organization, we now need to find ways of saving money, reducing our expenses. How do we do that? And a lot of organizations may be tempted to just go and kind of, I think it's maybe being unstructured in the way they do it. Opportunistic is maybe another word for it. But really the organizations that I see being most effective in thinking about how do we actually look at managing our expenses now in a world which is very different than what it was, even a month ago, 2 months ago, is to be programmatic about how you go and do that, structured around how you do that, because that's really what ultimately is going to help you deliver the biggest opportunity from a an expense management perspective, but also doing it in a way which still aligns with the needs of the business. And that's so, so important. I see so often, and I've been in companies where we've done this, where you take this bull in a china shop approach of, I got to save money and I got to save money at all costs. And I don't really care about the damage because I need to save money. And maybe
a lot of bad decisions are made when that's the sense of urgency, right?
Yeah. Maybe there's some organizations that are 2 weeks away from bankruptcy that don't have it's that or die, frankly. But most organizations who take that approach have the benefit of being a little bit more thoughtful. And being thoughtful, it takes things from what's my data telling me? What's my spend analytics? How much am I spending in what categories? Which of those categories where market conditions suggest that either they're under stress or there's opportunity for expense reduction? What does my business really need? How do I align exactly what I'm doing with the needs of the business, so that I'm not just doing things for the short term, and I'm not damaging all those relationships.
It always goes back to data, doesn't it, Scott?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We have, right?
Especially when you're trying to move as fast as we're trying to move right now, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton of noble missions going on. We're all familiar with them. Paul, you touched on PPE. Let's do this. I want to call a quick audible. Phil and Paul, you both have frameworks that I think our listeners are going to benefit from. Paul, I want to bring you in to comment on anything you just heard Phil go through, and then you've got a kind of a 4-step framework, or at least things for folks to think about, if you could share with our audience.
Yeah. First point, kind of around data. It's important. I think we're seeing as we're talking to, current customers, prospects, reaching out to organizations to see how we can help. You see those that had started the process, the digital supply chain transformation, looking at that data, really understanding that information. I think a lot of traditional processes are being exposed right now, where the length of time to complete some of these transformation projects isn't conducive with reality of everyday business, let alone something of this magnitude from a pandemic perspective. And I think that what we've seen, and some interesting things that we've seen, is organizations that are a little bit more prepared and taking a controlled approach based on, some things that Greg and Phil touched on earlier, utilizing this time while uncertain to begin that preparation or begin that process and utilize it to improve operations through understanding, through data, and laying that framework so that they can come out of it and manage through it more effectively, faster. That's the space we're in, and the way we see it is, things that hinder categorization and getting closer to suppliers and sourcing in these types of events is a lot of duplication in data and systems architecture challenges that are not easy to overcome, but traditionally, but us and a handful of new types of technologies and methodologies to accelerate what those traditional processes are, going from 18 to 12 to 6 to 3 months of being able to drive value and get back on your feet. So I think duplication in data leading to duplicate purchases, duplicate inventory, not knowing what you have, where you have it, from PPE to materials to keep production at trusted uptimes, and then ultimately to where am I sourcing goods to build my products to meet the demand spikes and changes. And as
hey Paul, real quick, we've got a comment from Fatima. I bet you're going to agree with. So Fatima says, in the current situation, we need IoT and AI, not just blockchain, to carry out the day-to-day operations. Blockchain alone cannot serve the issue.
Yeah,
I bet you would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, we talked about that once or twice. Yeah, well, the way we see it is, kind of like foundationally, data is the foundation. Getting that right and understood, not even necessarily cleansed, but understood to be able to appropriately drive business decisions, right? So connecting that data that applies and can get signals from IoT, and that can ultimately be thrown on a trusted ledger and executed that way where there is ultimate trust. It's really difficult to put the roof on the house before you've laid the foundation and the studs. So I think that this will lead, we just don't know when, we will lead to taking action on some of these items that have kind of had the can kicked on them a little bit. And I think they're all interconnected, right? So to the viewer's question, they should all be connected. They shouldn't be creating more silos. They shouldn't be creating more data challenges. There is a systematic way to do it, and it's understanding what you have, controlling what's coming in, and then that being able to add the appropriate signals will put individual organizations, whether it's procurement or ops managing inventory, on the same page, right? Align incentives. You can have, and Phil knows this, you can have cost reduction strategies, cost avoidance strategies, and still trust your inventory is nearly just in time. It's not one or the other. You don't need to create this excess and be misaligned with suppliers and have uncertainty, which is a four-letter word to operations people. There really is a common ground there and a gap to be bridged, and it is data and deep learning, and then obviously moving from there. Those activities.
Love it. So I want to circle back now to Phil and to our audience. We've got a ton of great questions. It's going to be very challenging to get Phil and Paul's and Greg's expertise out and get as many questions, but we'll take a stab at it. Greg, really quick question, but based on what you just heard from Paul, before we revisit and get Phil to share his framework, what's the most important thing Paul just said?
I think that the thing that both Phil and Paul have talked about is data and the value of it and consolidating it. I mean, let's face it, in these times, and there will be, if we aren't already technically in one, there will be a recession, at very least a recession. Cash is going to be king or queen as you see it. So one of the things that I think that Phil and Paul are both alluding to and enabling is, if you get your data right, whether you use technology right now or not, but if you get your data right, one of the things you can do is source from yourself. Is if you've got items and you can somehow figure out any number of those are duplicated, then source from yourself rather than outside the organization. And I think this goes to Pratik's question to some extent, is if your plan has gotten messed up, which everyone's has by this event, right? If your plan has gotten messed up, this pandemic is the Mike Tyson of supply chain. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Actually, we say until you get coughed in the face.
Oh, I saw that, right? Yeah. But having said that, if you can source from internally in any way, and data is the key to allowing you to do that, I think that's a great way to generate cash.
Yeah. And
we're seeing a lot of duplication, use it to your advantage.
Okay.
It's interesting because we've seen that, just one final point there, where global organizations have challenges across geographies, right? They have different instances and different systems, and they very well may have what they need, but they can't find it within North America. We were on multiple calls this week where that specific point was really heightened and exposed, and the inability to source from oneself within their own global supply chain, let alone externally.
Because Phil calls it a bottle and Paul calls it a jar, but it's exactly the same thing, right?
All right.
Red
So
hammer, hammer red, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So real quick aside, Michael and Matthew, I love how y'all are conversating in the LinkedIn thread. Of course, Michael with Procurement Foundry. So great to have you join us, and love the sentiment and the content. Okay, so Phil, let's get back to you. I loved your 5-step expense management process, and at an executive summary, right? The infographic altitude. Tell us more about those 5 steps.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit before about thinking about expense management and being programmatic about how you go about doing it. Talked a little bit about a couple of the early steps, before, data being the key. As the first step is understanding your spend. Who do you supply with? Who do you spend your money with? Who are your suppliers? When you look at that spend, which of that spend is actually critical versus which is non-critical for the organization? But something I want to say is, like, when you have times like this where you got to do it rapidly, I don't know how this will be taken, but you don't need to be 100% confident that it's the best data you ever got. It needs to be directionally accurate, because you can refine it later. You can refine how you categorize the suppliers a little bit later.
Yeah.
At least you have a skeleton of the data, so you have something that is going to start informing the decision-making process. So that's really the first step. Get that data. The second step is about the needs analysis. So what does your business and organization really need? Which of those products and services or suppliers that you buy that really are the most important to your organization versus those that maybe they're not so much? Because you want to take ultimately a different approach for those, because you've got to think about still the medium and the long term, as opposed to just thinking about everything with a short-term perspective. Something we talked about a little bit before was, putting in place contracts or initiatives, cost reduction initiatives, whatever it may be, that doesn't have the alignment with the business. Well, all you're doing is you're encouraging the stakeholders within the business, the users, to go and find a different way. So they'll always find a way to circumvent kind of the things that you put in place. That ultimately can cost you more money through what we call savings leakage or rogue spend than you're actually trying to save in the first place. The third step of this 5-step process is about building a governance structure. And that doesn't mean, oh gosh, we got a 5-step or 7-step or 10-step process where we got to get approvals all along the way for all these expense reduction initiatives that we're putting in place. But it's more the beginning of a project, make sure that the business is aligned on the strategy and the way that success is going to be measured. And at the end, you come back and say, were we all aligned on what the result is? And were we all aligned on the value that's going to be measured? Really just a strong way of getting folks all on the same page, as opposed to doing things, again, kind of in silos. You then come into the fourth of the 5 steps, which is about planning. We call that in procurement wave planning, as an example, and maybe that's what's used outside of procurement too. But it's all about looking at the prioritization. Where are the opportunities for quick wins? What are some of the contracts that are longer term that we have in place that we're really not going to be able to get to till later? Or maybe there's a really complex implementation cycle for a particular project, particular supplier. Maybe it's really embedded in our business. Maybe we should look at it later. So you start to prioritize based on all those factors and what our bandwidth is and what the bandwidth of our stakeholders are and what the market conditions look like in certain things that we buy. And then it's just about delivering. The 5th step is from a process perspective, I say just delivering. Obviously, delivering is where the rubber meets the road, but it's making sure you're then using the right tactics to deliver on ultimately the outcomes, the goals that you set. But thinking about it, as you say, from a programmatic basis, lets you drive change. It really involves change management as a part of that, so that you're really tying into organizational culture versus trying to push things on people that you may get a lot of pushback and resistance against.
All right. So data, need, structure, plan, and deliver are the 5 steps. So let's do this. I want to get directly to Pratik's question. And Greg, you addressed it kind of briefly there. Think Reader's Digest. So if you could answer Pratik's question in, say, a minute and a half or less, And let me refresh y'all's memory. So if the plan's unpredictable, how can he plan for inventory? In particular, Pratik talked about when the plan is changed while the inventory has already been shipped, so it's in transit. What do you do then? Paul, any initial thoughts on Pratik's question there?
Yeah, I think sounds a bit of a broken record, but understanding, to Phil's point, especially in these times, understanding your baseline data, having laid a foundation, and if it hasn't been laid, put some processes and technology and practices in place to understand the decisions that are being made and how they affect your inventory and supply, so that you can look to the appropriate demand signals to enter into that equation, right? Every organization has a lot of smart people, but the challenge is if you're not able to add that new development or those new demand signals to what you've historically planned for, you will not have any prediction, and you're going to be in a difficult situation in everyday business, let alone something that we're having here, is my first thought.
Yep.
And because without those key foundational steps that get you right, it's really tough to begin predicting what's out there and accepting those demand signals. So hopefully that was Reader's Digest.
Speaking of unpredictability, who would have thought the famous golf tournament that takes place in Augusta, Georgia each year would be taking place in November? So these are times we live in.
Shout out to Augusta here today.
That's right. Hey, Phil. All right. So again, Reader's Digest, lightning round. It's not an easy, brief answer, but what would be your response to Pratik?
Yeah. So for me, it's all about, I think it's being more proactive. It's a difficult one to answer from hey, this is a situation we have today, and how do we react to that immediately? I think about it more from an optionality perspective. How are we enabling and building up an optionality within our supply chain so that we can have flexibility if we don't know what the demand looks like, if we don't have confidence in the forecast. So as those forecasts change up and down, I have the ability, because I've reserved this capacity, for example, or I already have a stockpile here, and so I'm going to reduce my forecasts, knowing that I can go and tap into that later. Yep. The thing that I would say is whoever bears the risk, basically prices for that. So if you are going to bear the risk, and that means more inventory on your shelves because you're bringing that in and it's sat in a warehouse, you're not sure where you're going to use it, you know what, you're probably going to get a price concession for doing that because you're making a commitment to spend money. If you're not, and you're looking for optionality in your supply chain and perhaps looking at it being consigned at different times to you based on the point of use, you're going to pay a premium. So what's it worth to you, basically, is what I'd say.
Love that. Appreciate y'all being succinct. Greg, you've got a quick hot take on Pratik's answer as well, right?
This is going to be really succinct by my standards. If you've got inventory in motion and your plan, it doesn't reflect what your plan reflects today, then bring it in, centralize it as much as you can, or distribute it as much as you can when it hits the dock, but recover. You've got to focus on recovery. You can't focus on being efficient or optimal or any of that stuff, right? You are in crisis mode. So figure out how I can utilize this inventory effectively. Maybe it comes into warehouse 1 and you send some chunk of it to 3, 4, and 5 to get it dispersed to those areas and alleviate the problem.
So a couple quick comments. Mark suggests artificial azaleas may be in high demand in November.
Isn't that true? That was my first question. How are we going to get the azaleas to bloom in November?
Right. I want to welcome in.
How are they going to clean up all the leaves?
Yeah.
I want to say hello to Cabra that's tuned in from Istanbul. Hope you're doing well, Cabra. And we also, I want to challenge. So Mark, you're on the LinkedIn Live feed. Nick from EFT by Reuters Events asked about, which I'm not going to pose to our panel here because we're going to keep driving. Nick has a great question. Do you see this as the end of just-in-time manufacturing? So, Mark, I'm going to challenge you and any of our other audience members to answer that question in the comments. All right. So, Phil, I want to circle back to you because we're going to shift from the framework to.
That's my answer to Nick, by the way.
What's that?
That's my answer to Nick. We'll keep it brief.
I thought I was in trouble, Greg. All right, so
No, never.
Let's get back to tactics now. We've kind of walked through some frameworks. We've walked through some things to be thinking about. Let's now shift over to some expense reduction tactics, right? So Phil, walk us through a couple of those ideas, and then Paul, I'm gonna get you to weigh in on either ideas of your own or weigh in on some of the things that Phil has shared.
Yeah, sure. And what I would say is that there are so many different tactics that you can use. It's more about kind of horses for courses, which is the right tactic to use in the right circumstance, because whatever the challenges that you're faced with, whether it's in whether you have a really strong relationship with a supplier and it's more about partnering with them to look for ways that you can reduce the cost to serve, reduce their cost to serve by lowering metrics, for example. Maybe you have too higher KPIs that you don't really need, but you over-engineered them just to be safe. You can look at doing things like that to take cost out by reducing them to what you actually need. There's things that you can do from a value analysis and value engineering, looking at the processes that the product or service that you have, where it fits, how you can take some fat out of that maybe that exists, or how you can help a supplier actually reduce their own internal costs from negotiating with the tier 2 suppliers, because you have better deals with some of the providers, use some of that leverage, so their input costs from that perspective are going to be lower. You benefit that way. So it doesn't have to be going and beating up a supplier saying, hey, I want a 3% or 5% or whatever that number is, cost reduction. You can do this in a really collaborative way. So there's ways, let's say, from an incumbent supplier. Something else I'd say is from a demand management. We touched on this a little bit earlier. Greg was saying about looking for where we actually, what can we reuse, or what have we bought that we don't even know we've bought duplicate of it. Start looking for things that we don't actually need. We talk about the fact that, you spend 100%, so you save 100% of what you don't spend, essentially. So what are things that just aren't needed anymore, that again were nice to have? So you had the budget, you spent the money, now the budget's gone, don't really need that. That's not going and beating the supplier. That's looking at your own kind of usage, looking at approval levels, making it a little bit more restrictive for folks to actually go and buy than you may have had in the past. Again, it's not damaging your supplier relationships, just being a little bit more responsible about what you spend, how you spend it. And as much as I hate control, a lot of organizations right now are going to be needing to put in a bit more control over some of those buying decisions.
So Phil, we're not going to be able to do it justice and get through all of it here today, but you've got a great expense management cheat sheet that I think folks can get at Art of Procurement, right?
Yeah, that's right. Just go, it's at artofprocurement.com/expense management. You'll find it right there. I'll make sure that as soon as we finish here, that the URL redirects straight to it so folks can take a look. Perfect.
Thanks so much. Quick comment from McCaskey, wherever you are. Hope you're doing well. Appreciate the feedback. I'll tell you, this is like the Wild Wild West episode of procurement leadership. Okay, so Paul, let's shift over. Phil shared a couple of ideas there. Feel free to piggyback on some things that he shared, or share some of your own proven best practices.
Yeah, I think it goes back to purchasing a duplicative purchasing. Say that 5 times fast. Not knowing what you have both physically and digitally leads to some significant challenges where you're paying different prices, you're subjectively stocking, and I think we'll see a lot of that coming out of the current environment, where safety stock levels will be bumped up for a period of time because it feels good to do so. Not because the data is telling you to do so, right? So I think getting a grasp of that and being able to identify and be a little bit more nimble and proactive in taking action on eliminating the the growth of what you're overstocking, right? You know, from that perspective, it goes back to, you know, Greg's answer of will just-in-time go away? I don't think so. I don't think it needs to necessarily. I think those foundational aspects of the supply chain working together more effectively on the data front and allowing each other to know and be able to pass that information appropriately, whether on a blockchain or not, but just having a better understanding and being able to be more proactive in your reactivity will be really the way we go. And I think the supply chain as a whole will get much better, and the, you know, whether verticals, industries, depending on which node you're talking about, I think we'll all see, you know, a supply chain renaissance of sorts coming out of this that is going to be really fun to be a part of. I
like that. Reminds me of William Shakespeare for supply chain. So supply chain renaissance of sorts. Amanda kicked me for making that dad joke there. But all right, so quick comment from Jonathan Townsley, which echoes something that Mark shared. Supplier development and collaboration will be key for all of us. Great comment there from our dear friend Jonathan. Greg, now that Phil and Paul have shared a couple of ideas, weigh on that real quick, and then I'm going to pose a great question to the panel from our friend Claudia. That's going to we'll see who the brave soul is that steps up and answer it. So, Greg, what's your quick take?
I'd have to say that a lot of things are going to change coming out of this. One of the concerns that I have is that the thing that won't change is the bullwhip effect, and that companies won't, as both Phil and Paul have mentioned, they won't identify the data that comes out of this pandemic as exceptional, and it may cause them to, you know, the ultimate example of the bullwhip effect is Volvo couldn't sell green cars, so they put the green cars on sale at low prices. And then manufacturing saw green cars selling fast, didn't know that they were being promoted, and built more green cars. So what I think all of us here would encourage people to do is to not only look at the raw data, but to give it your own perspective and to tag it somehow as an exception, as an anomaly, and don't use it next year to make the decisions for procurement.
Love it. Love it. So Matthew agrees with your quick assessment there, Paul. 100% supply chain renaissance with Web 3.0. So appreciate that, Matthew. Paul, maybe got some T-shirts in the making with your phrase there.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Claudia. So Claudia is our dear friend. We interviewed her in Las Vegas as part of the Reverse Logistics Association big yearly event. Great interview. Claudia asked a great question, and the first person to step across the line is who will take the first hack at it. She asked, how can inventory management prevent surplus scandals like food being wasted or landfilled due to supply chain disruption? Who would like to take a hack at that?
Can you repeat the question, please, Scott?
Sure. And maybe Clay, I don't know if you can type as fast as I can talk, probably a lot faster. Claudia asked, how can successful inventory management, prevent surplus scandals like food being wasted or being shipped off to landfill rather than being repurposed maybe due to supply chain disruption?
I'll take it. I'll at least take a shot. One of you guys back me up, please.
Yeah.
I don't think it can, in truth. Food will undoubtedly be wasted, right? I mean, if you think about it, think about how rapidly we have stopped the demand against restaurants. All of those restaurants had the food they needed for the next week, and next week didn't happen.
Yeah.
So unless we can redirect enough demand to those restaurants, or they can find another channel for that demand, it will undoubtedly go to waste. Now, the question is whether that's really an inventory management issue, but I think once demand settles back in, it goes back to the point I was just making on the bullwhip effect. Let's not do something stupid and think that this peak of demand is going to continue when everybody comes back. We have to be very, very cautious with building inventories when this is all over and everyone goes out to dinner and parties their butts off for 2.5 weeks. We
with
have
their
to
garage full
in supporting that, or else we'll wind up with a month's worth of stuff when people are only going to party for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is. Truly, that's a guess as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
With garage fulls of toilet paper, undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Paul, were you going to weigh in?
Yeah, no, I think that I agree with Greg. It's going to be very difficult in this environment, but as we prepare for what comes next, and hopefully doesn't happen again, but likely will. I think IoT is there's a really important place for IoT to play in this, and being able to harness that information and know where things are, when they expire, where they can be routed to places of need. There are areas, and there's actually a fortunate opportunity through the Engage VC program here in Atlanta to be connected with a company that's doing a lot of good in Atlanta, so much that the name of their company is Gooder. Jasmine Crow is taking a lot of that food that would have gone to waste and routing it through her network and technology to those families in need. And really remarkable there. And actually just had a conversation within the last 2 weeks with another entrepreneur in the IoT space that are building smart kitchens, smart facilities that can help identify these types of things and not have not be handcuffed by the data. Right, it goes back to data, but I think that there are mechanisms to help it ultimately, but it's going to be going to have to invest in it and not go back to business as usual. Right.
Yep. All right.
Yeah.
Good stuff there, Paul. I want to share Caskey real quick. Try to get to 99% inventory accuracy and keep it that way. And then he also follows up with he's seen it go the other way during good times, which is an interesting observation there. Phil, to give you a chance to weigh in on Claudia's question.
Yeah, first of all, I'm happy that you guys took the first stab, because I'm certainly no inventory expert. The thing that comes to mind, though, as I kind of hear you both responding to that, is that we're in times where kind of this idea of community collaboration is obviously far stronger than it's ever been before, and that kind of transcends business, if you will. At some point that's going to change, because at some point you're going to get back to whatever the new normal is, and maybe a situation where everyone's kind of looking out for themselves first. But when you think about challenges like this, I think about opportunities that exist for people to trade those. They've overstocked in one area. There's going to be people locally, whether it's going to be restaurants as they're reopening or whatever, where the demand is going to shift. So, I don't know if platforms exist, but whether there's a way for folks to start trading amongst themselves as opposed to just letting things go to waste. And that's kind of thinking about it from a solution perspective.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the things that Paul mentioned. Jasmine Crow's company is called Gooder, G-O-D-D-R. G-O-O-D-R, sorry, .co, right? And what they do is they take product from restaurants. Now, this is under normal conditions.
Yeah.
And then they take it to charitable philanthropic organizations and make sure that they're able to use it. So there are mechanisms for that kind of thing. They just don't have the capacity that's necessary for an environment like this.
Yeah, it's tough. And it's tough to scale. Yeah, scale up the people that are needed to distribute there, and I think it'll get better.
So I want to pose a question to y'all and have you come back with a really quick answer on a 1 to 10 scale. Stand by 1 minute. I want to say hello to Rena. Rena, who came in from Kentucky. Hope you're doing well. Rena, also want to read this comment from Thitsa. Open tendering is normally used, but as it is, we need to use direct appointment of course taking ethical procurement into consideration because suppliers take advantage of the situation over price. again, we need to be aware of this. And I may not have read that perfectly, but clearly ethical procurement practices being studied and being aware of some of the folks that are being overly aggressively opportunistic during these times. Okay, so let's go back to next question. I think I already know what each of you are going to say, but I'm going to pose it to you. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning we'll never see it again, 10 meaning once we break through and get to the aftermath, it'll be very close to current state. Do you see this as the end of just-in-time manufacturing? Give me a quick answer, 1 to 10 on that scale. Greg?
9.
Okay. Paul? Uh-oh, might have a frozen screen.
Paul.
We'll keep driving.
That's all right.
Phil?
Hold up fingers.
Yeah, so I can't recall the top or the bottom end of the scale, but basically, I don't think it's an end to just in time. I don't
There we go.
anything from that perspective.
There you go.
Maybe how you access, maybe how you configure your supply chain changes, but the idea of just in time will continue as business as usual, I think.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Okay.
What was it you asked? I weirdly lost audio for nor
Okay.
speak.
So we were asking really quick take. 1 meaning goes away, 10 meaning it stays, especially as soon as we get through just-in-time manufacturing on a scale of 1 to 10.
10 being it goes away or it stays. What was that?
10 meaning it stays.
Yeah, I think I'm with Greg. I think it's 8, 9, 10. I think we're going to be better equipped and better prepared. I don't think it'll go away. It'll probably, like we mentioned earlier, there will be just a human element of trust and subjective good feeling that you have some stock until you start looking at the working cap.
Yep. We got a connection issue there, maybe Paul. All right, so. Uh-oh. Okay. Technical difficulties. Hey, everybody's using the internet at the same time these days. Want to give a quick shout out to my friend, fellow data analyst from the United States Air Force. I served with Troy Boozer at McConnell Air Force Base in Wichita, Kansas. Hope you're doing well, Troy. All right, so let's wrap up here. I hate, there's so much more we could get to. And we try to get through as much of the content as we brought into, and clearly there's a lot of passion around procurement these days across our audiences. But Phil, I want to make sure that folks can connect with you and with Paul. So Phil, how can folks connect with you and learn more about art of procurement?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for the question, Scott. So folks can connect with me on LinkedIn. Always will accept invites and connection requests there. Our website is artofprocurement.com. So just go there. There'll be a contact form. You can learn a little bit more about us, check out the podcast. And the things we talked about today from an expense management perspective, like you said, we've really put together a long guide we have like 24 different tactics in this guide of how you can use different strategies and tactics to help manage your expenses. That'll just be at artofprocurement.com/expense management, and check that out. Hopefully it will give you some ideas and just help you kind of along the way.
Outstanding. And it looks like we lost Paul. And thanks for joining us, by the way, Phil. Really glad we finally were able to catch up and feature your thought leadership here. I know you've got a great, well-respected podcast and publishing books, and it's great to finally feature you with our Supply Chain Now audience. Paul, let's speak for Paul, Greg. So you can obviously
J. Noble on LinkedIn.
Yep. And Verusen.com, right?
Yep. Verusen.
And all that.
Verusen. Verusen.
That's right. And we've made it easy, really easy, hopefully for our audience. We have featured the direct links to both Phil and Paul in the show notes across all channels except for Twitter. So you can find them there. Okay, Greg, I'm almost scared to ask you, what's your key takeaway here?
I think one thing that we've seen, not just in this session, but in others, is this discussion of trust and integration of organizations. If we're going to be able to avoid the catastrophic events that have occurred during this pandemic, then as Phil and Paul and earlier today, other people said, and yesterday, Priya and Mary Kate both said we have to have integration of organizations outside of each organization's four walls, right? We need enterprise commerce, and it takes trust to do that. And developing that trust will give us the ability to meet these kind of things head on much, much better.
Love it. Okay. Well, we got to wrap there. Really appreciate Phil Ideson with Art of Procurement and Paul Noble with Verusen joining us for a fast-moving, fast-paced, hold no punches discussion. To our audience that we could not get to, really appreciate all the engagement and the comments and the questions. We're going to have to add a couple more screens here so we can better manage everything.
You look like
Greg, really enjoyed it. Today's been an outstanding day. We did this conversation obviously live. We had Logistics with Purpose with Rise Against Hunger and Vector Global Logistics this morning. Have an outstanding podcast we'll be releasing soon. There's so much good news out there. I know it's a tough time for so many people, but if you look for good news, there's outstanding stories with all focused on brave individuals that are doing incredible things to fight against what we're all facing, COVID-19. So thank you for what you do. And Greg, why don't you take us out?
All right. Well, first of all, thanks to Paul and to Phil. I want to thank you both again. We've gotten to talk on the phone. It's great to have you share you with our audience and have them get a quick look at your knowledge. Look, check us out. If you're interested in what we're doing at Supply Chain Now, you can check us out at Supply Chain Now Radio. All of our podcasts and all of these live streams are also existing on all of our social channels. I'll just encourage you to keep a positive attitude, keep looking up, keep looking forward, be safe, follow the guidance of our leaders out there and those of us who are giving us good guidance in terms of how to remain healthy. Don't forget to say thank you to Scott Luton for bringing us this whole thing to begin with so we can all get together. And as Scott loves to say, brighter days lie ahead, and he's always right. So let me just thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you on the next time on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.